By the time the police pulled into the parking lot, the man in the white SUV was shouting that I had attacked him first, even though there was a bright red handprint burning across my cheek, and at least 3 people had their phones pointed in our direction. 15 minutes earlier, I had been thinking about nothing more serious than whether I had enough coffee left for Monday morning. That is how fast an ordinary Saturday can become the kind of story strangers argue about online, especially when the person yelling has spent his whole life believing the loudest voice in the room should automatically win. My name is Tessa Monroe. I was 31 years old that summer, and I worked 6 days a week as a physical therapy assistant at a rehab center outside Millhaven, Indiana. It was not glamorous work, but I loved it. I helped people learn how to trust their legs again after surgeries, strokes, accidents, all the things that make life look you in the eye and say, well, now what? By Saturday evening, I was usually running on cafeteria coffee, granola bars, and whatever patience I had left in my body. That day had been especially long because one of my patients, a sweet old man named Mr. Givens, had taken 3 stubborn steps without his walker for the first time in months, then looked at me like he had just won the Kentucky Derby. I was still smiling about that when I pulled into the Market Basket parking lot around 6:30. It was one of those humid July evenings where the air felt thick enough to chew, the kind where everyone looked tired, irritated, and one bad coupon away from starting a small war. The parking lot was packed. Minivans drifted through the rows like confused whales, carts rolled loose in the wind, and every closed space had somebody waiting for it, with their blinker on like they had purchased the rights to the pavement. I'd driven around twice before I spotted an open space near the entrance, right beside the little cart return with the crooked blue sign. I slowed down, checked both sides, and pulled in clean, perfectly between the lines. I remember that part because later, when people asked whether I might have cut someone off, I kept thinking, no, I had not. I had not flown in from another dimension. I had not rammed anybody. I had simply seen an empty spot and parked in it. I had barely shifted into park when I heard tires squeal beside me. A white Ford Expedition shot into the lane and stopped so close to my driver's side door that I could not have opened it without scraping his paint. I looked over, and there he was. A man maybe in his mid-50s, broad shoulders, sunburned neck, thinning gray hair, a faded golf shirt stretched tight over his stomach. He had one hand locked around the steering wheel and the kind of angry face that told you he had been practicing for this conversation before you even arrived. He rolled down his window and pointed at me. That spot was mine, he said. I looked around, honestly confused. There was no car behind me, no blinker, no one waiting in the lane when I turned in. I said, I am sorry, sir, but I did not see anyone waiting. He laughed once, but there was no humor in it. Of course you did not, he said. People like you never see anybody but yourselves. I wish I could tell you those words surprised me. They did not. I am black, and I had heard people like you before, usually dressed up in softer language, sometimes hidden behind a joke, sometimes buried in a complaint about manners or neighborhoods, or who belonged where. But there was nothing soft about the way he said it. He opened his door and stepped out of the SUV. I remember seeing a half-empty fast food cup fall over in his passenger seat as he moved, and I remember thinking, this man is going to make a whole scene over a parking space. Later, I would learn that his name was Glenn Harrow, that he owned a small roofing company that had lost a major contract that week, that he had been fighting with his brother about money, and that he had spent most of the afternoon driving around angry at the world. None of that made what happened make sense, but it did explain something important. Glenn was not angry because I stole a parking space. He was angry because the day had made him feel small, and he had found someone he thought he could make feel smaller. He walked up to my car and stopped right next to my door. I cracked my window just enough to speak. Sir, I said, I am not trying to argue with you. I did not see you, and I am not moving while you are blocking my door. His eyes narrowed. You are not moving because you think you are special, he said. I took a breath. My grandmother used to say, never wrestle with a pig in public because both of you get dirty and the pig enjoys the attention. I wanted to remember that advice so badly. I wanted to be the bigger person, the calmer person, the woman who did not let some stranger drag her into his mess. So I kept my voice low and said, I just got off work. I am going inside for 10 minutes. You can either wait or find another spot. That was probably the wrong thing to say, not because it was rude, but because men like Glenn do not hear calmness as calmness. They hear it as defiance. He leaned closer to the window. You think you can talk to me like that, he said. I looked at him and said, "I think I can talk to you like a person." For a second, he just stared at me. The people walking by started to notice. A young couple slowed down near the cart return. An older woman with a paper bag of dog food stopped behind a sedan and watched over the roof. A teenage cashier in a green apron stood near the automatic doors, looking nervous but curious. Nobody said anything. That is one of the strange parts of public conflict. People see it, they know it is wrong. But everyone is waiting for somebody else to be the first person to step in. Glenn tapped his finger against the top of my door. Tap, tap, tap. Slow, deliberate, like he was testing the lid on a jar. "You people always act like the rules do not apply to you," he said. I felt my stomach tighten. I had spent my whole life learning how to read rooms, how to decide whether something was worth responding to, how to smile through the small, ugly things people say when they think they can get away with it. But there are moments when you realize somebody is not just being rude. They are trying to push you into a corner, and they want you to either explode or disappear. Glenn wanted me to explode. He wanted a reason to call me angry, difficult, dangerous. I was not going to give him one. I reached for my purse, pulled out my phone, and said, "I am calling store security." He laughed again. "Call whoever you want. I am not scared of you." I said, "Good. Then you will not mind waiting for them." That was when he moved around the front of my car and stood directly in front of me. He had not touched me yet, but suddenly my car felt smaller. The windows felt smaller. The space between us felt like it was shrinking. I could hear the low hum of shopping carts, the beeping from somebody locking their car, a child whining near the entrance. All those ordinary little sounds happening around something that was becoming very wrong. I pressed the button to unlock my door, but Glenn had positioned himself so close that I could not get out without pushing into him. He saw me look down at the handle and smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile people wear when they think they have found a way to control the next move. "What are you going to do now?" he asked. I looked him right in the eye and said, "I am going to stand here until you move." He stepped closer. I could smell cigarette smoke on his shirt and something sour under it. Sweat maybe, anger maybe. I do not know. He raised his voice so everyone in the nearest row could hear. "Look at her," he said, "sitting in my spot like she owns the place." I almost laughed because it was so ridiculous. My car was a 7-year-old Honda Civic with a dent near the back bumper and a cracked cup holder. I was wearing scrubs under a denim jacket. My hair was tied up in a messy knot, and I had spent the last hour helping an 82-year-old man learn how to climb 3 stairs. I did not feel like I owned anything in that moment except my own exhaustion. Still, I kept my voice even. "It is a parking spot, Glenn. Find another one." That is when his face changed. It was subtle at first, just a tightening around his mouth, but I saw it. Something in him snapped because I had used his name. I had read it off the company logo stitched above his chest pocket, Harrow Roofing and Restoration. He did not like that I had turned him from some angry stranger into an actual person with an actual identity. He did not like that I was still not afraid enough. "Do not say my name," he said. I said, "Then do not make me remember it." He took one more step forward. The older woman with the dog food finally said, "Sir, you need to back up." Glenn swung his head toward her so fast she flinched. "Mind your business," he barked. And then, before I could say another word, before I could lift my phone, before I could even process that he was raising his hand, Glenn slapped me across the face. It was not the kind of slap that knocks someone across a room. Real life is rarely that dramatic. It was worse in a quieter way. Fast, sharp, humiliating. My head turned to the side, my earring flew out, and for about 2 seconds the whole parking lot went silent. I could hear my own breathing. I could feel the heat spreading across my cheek. I could see the reflection of his SUV in my side mirror, warped and shaking. Glenn stood there looking almost pleased with himself, like he had finally put the world back in the order he preferred. That was his mistake. He thought the slap would make me smaller. He thought it would make me cry, get in my car, drive away, and spend the rest of the night wondering whether I had somehow brought it on myself. Instead, I looked at him, really looked at him, and something inside me went still. Not wild, not reckless, still. I set my purse down on the hood of my car, raised my phone, and said, "You just made the worst decision of your life." Glenn gave me a crooked little grin. "Then prove it. Then prove it." He said it like he had already decided how the story would end, like he had spent enough years bullying people into silence that the idea of consequences felt almost funny to him. My hand was still shaking, but I hit the record button on my phone anyway. I wish I could tell you I suddenly became one of those calm, fearless women from courtroom dramas, the kind who speaks in perfect sentences while chaos unfolds around her. But that would be a lie. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, my cheek was on fire, and part of me wanted to get in my car and drive until I ran out of road. But another part of me, the part that had watched too many people get dismissed, doubted, and told to just let it go, was done making myself smaller so somebody else could feel bigger. I looked at Glenn and said, "You hit me, you blocked my car, and there are people here who saw it." He glanced around for the first time, really glanced around, and I watched him notice the phones. The young couple by the cart returned and stopped pretending they were not watching. The teenage cashier had his phone held up at chest level, trying to be discreet and failing badly. Even the older woman with the dog food had pulled hers out, though she looked like she had probably used it more for photos of grandkids than evidence in parking lot crimes. Glenn's face shifted just for a second. It was not fear exactly, it was irritation. He hated that he was no longer in control of the audience. He stepped toward me again, and the older woman raised her voice. "Do not touch her again," she said. Glenn turned toward her, and I saw the anger flare in his eyes. "Lady, stay out of this." She did not move. "I have been married 46 years," she said, "and I have seen enough grown men throw tantrums to know one when I see it." A few people nearby made that small sound people make when somebody finally says what everybody else was thinking. Not quite a laugh, more like a shared breath. Glenn heard it too. His face darkened. For a moment I thought he might come at her, and that was when the young man in the green apron stepped forward from the entrance. "Sir," he said, "security is on the way." Glenn looked at him, then back at me, then at the phones, the witnesses, the little crowd that had formed around his anger like it had become a street performance nobody had asked for. And suddenly he did what people like Glenn often do when the room stops bending around them. He changed the story. "This woman attacked me," he said loudly. "She assaulted me. I was defending myself." I actually laughed then, not because it was funny, although part of it was so ridiculous it almost was. It was the kind of laugh that comes out when your brain cannot decide whether to scream or cry. I pointed at my cheek. "You slapped me. Everybody saw you slap me." Glenn folded his arms. "You were mouthing off. You came at me. You hit me." I shook my head. "No, Glenn, not yet." He stared at me, confused, for half a second, and then I did something I had not planned to do. I stepped closer, not close enough for him to touch me, but close enough that he could hear every word. "You do not get to hit a woman, call her whatever you want, block her in, and then decide you are the victim because people are watching." He gave me a hard look. "You think this is over?" I said. "No. I think this is just where it starts." Security arrived about a minute later, though it felt longer. One was a tall guy named Marcus with a shaved head and a radio clipped to his belt, and the other was a woman, maybe in her 40s, named Denise, who looked tired in the way people look when they have dealt with human nonsense all day. Marcus walked straight between Glenn and me and said, "Sir, step back from the vehicle." Glenn immediately put on a different voice, softer now, wounded even. "I am just trying to explain what happened," he said. Denise looked at me, then at the red mark on my face, then at the crowd holding phones. Her expression did not change much, but her voice got colder. "You can explain it from over there," she said. Glenn moved back 2 steps, muttering under his breath. I called 911 while Denise asked me what happened. My voice trembled at first, but once I started talking, the details came out clean and sharp. He said the space was his. He blocked my door. He made racist comments. He slapped me. I pointed to Glenn's SUV and told her that he had been standing close enough to my car that I could not get out safely. The older woman, whose name turned out to be June, stepped forward and said, "I saw him hit her." The young couple said the same thing. The cashier, his name was Eli, told security that he had started recording right before the slap because he could tell something was wrong. Glenn heard all of that, and his jaw tightened. He kept looking at me like I had done something unforgivable by refusing to let him rewrite the scene. The police arrived fast, 2 officers in separate cruisers, lights flashing across the hot pavement and reflecting off the windows of the store. For the first time since Glenn stepped out of that SUV, I felt my shoulders loosen a little. Not because I trusted that everything would magically be fixed, but because there were now people whose job it was to listen. Officer Nolan approached me first. A woman with dark blonde hair pulled back in a tight braid and the kind of steady eyes that made you feel like she was actually hearing you. She asked if I needed medical attention. I told her I did not think so. She touched her own cheek lightly and said, "It is going to bruise." "I know," I said. She looked over at Glenn. Did he do that? Yes. She nodded once and began taking notes. Across the lot, another officer was talking to Glenn. I could not hear every word, but I could hear his voice getting louder. He was gesturing toward me, pointing, shaking his head, doing everything except admitting what happened. At one point, he looked directly at me and shouted, "She is lying. That woman is lying." Officer Nolan did not look up from her notepad. She asked me to walk her through the entire thing from the moment I pulled into the space. So I did. I told her about the SUV stopping inches from my door, about Glenn saying the spot was his, about the way he used the phrase "people like you," about him blocking me in, touching my car, stepping closer, and then slapping me. When I finished, she asked, "Did you strike him back?" I hesitated. I was not going to lie. I said, "Not then." She looked at me. "What do you mean, not then?" I told her the truth. I told her that after he slapped me, after he stood there looking proud of himself, I had wanted to hit him. I had wanted to do something that would make him understand even a fraction of what he had just done. But I did not. I had stood there, recorded him, and called for help. Officer Nolan nodded slowly. "Good," she said. "That matters." I looked at her and said, "It should not have to matter." He still hit me. She stopped writing for a second. "You are right," she said. "It should not have to." Then she looked back at Glenn's SUV. "Is there anything else we need to know?" I almost said no. I almost let the whole thing end there. But then I saw something on the side of my car. At first I thought it was just dirt, maybe a shadow from the cart return, but when I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. There was a long scratch running from the back passenger door almost all the way to the rear panel. It cut through the paint in a jagged silver line. I stood there staring at it, and for a second I could not breathe. My Hondo was not fancy, it was not new, but I had bought it myself, paid for it myself, took care of it because I had worked hard for every bit of stability it gave me. That scratch felt personal in a way I could not explain. It was not just damage. It was Glenn leaving behind proof that he wanted to punish me for not giving him what he wanted. Officer Nolan came over beside me. "Did this happen today?" "Yes," I said. "I went inside for maybe 10 minutes. When I came back out, it was there." I did not see him do it, but he was still sitting in that SUV when I came out. She crouched down, ran her eyes along the length of the scratch, then looked toward the store entrance. "Are there cameras covering this row?" Denise from security stepped closer. "Yes," she said. "We have 2 cameras facing the front lanes and 1 over the cart return." Officer Nolan looked at me, and I could see the entire case shift in that one quiet moment. Glenn had been loud. Glenn had been confident. Glenn had probably spent the last 20 minutes believing he could talk his way out of anything. But cameras do not get intimidated. Cameras do not care how angry you are, how important you think you are, or how convincing your lie sounds when you say it with your chest out. They just keep watching. Across the lot, Glenn must have realized what was happening, because he started walking toward us. The other officer stopped him. "Sir, stay by your vehicle." Glenn pointed at my car. "She is trying to frame me now." I did not touch her car. Officer Nolan looked at him for the first time. "Nobody asked you a question yet, Mr. Harrow." His face tightened at the sound of his name. She continued, "But we are about to review the footage." Glenn stood completely still. It was the first time all evening I had seen him run out of words. And as security led Officer Nolan toward the store office to pull the video, I stood beside my scratched-up car, pressing a cold bottle of water against my cheek, wondering whether the truth would finally be enough, or whether Glenn Harrow was about to find one more way to turn the whole thing against me. The store office was colder than the parking lot, the kind of cold that made the sweat on the back of my neck feel like ice. And while Officer Nolan stood beside the security manager waiting for the footage to load, I sat in a plastic chair with a bottle of water against my face and tried not to imagine all the ways this could still go wrong. You learn something when you're standing in the middle of a mess like that. Even when you know you are telling the truth, even when people saw what happened, you still start doubting yourself because you know how easily a confident liar can make you sound uncertain. Glenn had spent the entire evening talking like he had a lawyer in his pocket and a judge in his family. He kept saying things like, "You have no idea who you are dealing with," which is a very dramatic sentence for a man standing next to a dented Ford Expedition outside a grocery store. But it still got under my skin. I kept hearing his voice in my head. I kept thinking about the scratch on my car, the sting in my cheek, the way he looked at me after he slapped me, like he had expected me to vanish. Then the security manager clicked something on the monitor and said, "There we go." Officer Nolan pulled a chair closer. Denise stood behind us with her arms crossed. The first camera angle showed the front lane of the parking lot from above. The picture was grainy but clear enough. There was my little Honda coming down the row, slow and careful. There was the empty spot. There was no vehicle waiting for it. No blinker. No SUV creeping behind me. No Glenn. Nothing. I watched myself pull into the space and felt something loosen in my chest. I had not imagined it. I had not cut him off. I had not taken anything from him. Then Glenn's SUV appeared from the other side of the lane, moving way too fast, cutting around another car and stopping beside me so close that his passenger mirror nearly touched my window. The footage had no sound, but it did not need it. You could see his body language. You could see him climb out, point at my car, pace around the driver's side, lean down toward my window, step closer again. You could see me sitting there with both hands open in front of me, trying to talk. You could see the little crowd forming. Then came the moment that made the whole room go quiet. Glenn lifted his hand and hit me. It happened so fast on the screen that I barely recognized it. But there it was, undeniable and ugly, my head snapping to the side, my earring dropping near the curb, the woman with the dog food stepping forward, the teenager raising his phone. Officer Nolan paused the video. Nobody said anything for a few seconds. Then she looked at me and said, "I am sorry you had to go through that." It was not a dramatic statement. It was not one of those movie moments where everyone suddenly understands the weight of your pain. But something about the way she said it made my eyes burn. Because until then, I had been holding myself together by force. I had been trying to sound reasonable, factual, calm, like I was presenting a report instead of talking about a stranger putting his hands on me in public. Hearing somebody say they believed me made it harder to keep pretending I was fine. I swallowed and asked, "Is there another camera for the car?" Denise nodded. The third camera faced the cart return and part of the row where my Honda was parked. The timestamp showed that I had gone into the store at 6:48. Glenn stayed in his SUV for a few minutes. He looked around. He got out. He walked slowly toward my car, holding something small in his right hand. It took me a second to understand what I was looking at. Then he leaned down beside my passenger door and dragged that object along the side of my car, all the way from the back door to the rear panel. He did it once, then stepped back, looked at the damage, and did it again. There was no confusion, no accident, no misunderstanding. He did not bump into my car with a shopping cart. He did not brush past it by mistake. He keyed it on purpose, slowly, calmly, like he wanted to make sure I would notice. But the part that hit me hardest was what happened after. He walked back to his SUV, sat down, and waited. He waited for me to come outside. He waited for me to see it. When I finally returned with my grocery bag, the camera caught him watching through his windshield. He did not look shocked. He did not look guilty. He smiled. I felt my throat tighten. I had seen that smile in person, but from the camera angle, it looked even worse. It was not anger anymore. It was satisfaction. Officer Nolan leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. "Well," she said, "that answers a few questions." I did not say anything. I could not. I just stared at the screen until the security manager paused it on Glenn's face. It was strange seeing him frozen there, trapped in one frame, because a few minutes earlier he had been standing in the parking lot acting like he controlled the whole world. Now he was just a man on a security camera, caught doing something mean and stupid because he could not stand being told no. Officer Nolan stood up. "Miss Monroe," she said, "we are going to go back outside. I need you to stay here with Denise for a few minutes. We are going to speak with Mr. Purrs." Harold again. The way she said speak with him told me they were not going to have a friendly chat. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, though it felt like an hour. Denise offered me a paper cup of water and asked if I wanted someone to call a friend or family member. I almost called my sister Kayla, but I knew if she heard my voice she would leave her house in pajamas and drive over ready to fight every police officer, security guard, and grocery cart in Millhaven, so I texted her instead. "I am okay. Long story. Do not panic." She called me in less than 5 seconds. I answered and said, "Before you say anything, I am physically okay." She said, "Tessa, why do you sound like you were trying to convince yourself?" That was my sister. She had a way of walking straight through whatever lie you were telling yourself and sitting down in the middle of it. I told her what happened, not every detail, just enough. By the time I finished, her voice had gone quiet. Then she said, "I am coming." I told her not to. She said, "That was not a question." She arrived just as Officer Nolan came back into the office. My sister walked in wearing house slippers, an oversized sweatshirt, in the expression of someone who had been given a reason to become a problem. She hugged me so hard I almost dropped the water bottle. Then she looked at Officer Nolan and asked, "Is he still here?" Officer Nolan nodded. "He is being detained." Kayla looked toward the door. "Good. I hope his seatbelt locks on the way to the station." Officer Nolan almost smiled. She told us that Glenn had continued denying everything until they showed him still images from the footage. According to the other officer, Glenn first claimed the video was misleading, then claimed he had only scratched my car because he thought I had damaged his SUV. Then said he was upset and had not been thinking clearly. Apparently, when Officer Nolan asked him why he had waited in the parking lot to watch me see the damage, he had no answer. That was when they placed him under arrest for assault and criminal mischief, and because the video also showed him blocking my door and escalating the confrontation, the report would include harassment and bias-related language as part of the investigation. I did not cheer. I did not clap. I just sat there staring at the floor, feeling tired in a way I had never felt before. It was not the good kind of tired you get after finishing a long shift or cleaning your whole apartment on a Sunday. It was the kind that lives deep in your bones. I kept thinking, this man had changed my entire night because he felt entitled to a parking spot. But really, it was never about the parking spot. It was about control. It was about him deciding that I was the kind of person he could corner, insult, and punish without consequences. And what bothered me most was how close he had come to getting away with it. If there had been no camera, if June had not spoken up, if Eli had not recorded, if I had driven away because I was scared or embarrassed, Glenn would have told everyone I was aggressive, difficult, emotional, maybe even dangerous, and some people would have believed him because he was older, louder, white, male, and confident enough to lie without blinking. That thought stayed with me all night. Taylor drove me home because my hands were still shaking too badly to drive. She made me sit on the couch while she put ice on my cheek and inspected the scratch on my car like she was a crime scene investigator in a true crime documentary. At one point, she ran her finger along the damage and said, "I hope he enjoys paying for this." I told her that was not what mattered. She looked at me and said, "It matters a little." I laughed, and it hurt my cheek, but I laughed anyway. That was the first time all night I felt even a little like myself again. The next few weeks were not easy. People think once police take someone away, the story ends. It does not. The actual event is only the beginning. Then come the statements, the reports, the phone calls, the photos, the court dates, the moments when somebody asked you to describe the worst part again because they need it on the record. I had to return to the police station 2 days later to give a formal statement. Officer Nolan sat across from me with a recorder on the table and asked me to go through everything in order. The parking space, the comments, the way Glenn blocked the door, the slap, the scratch. Every time I reached the part where he hit me, I felt my body tense like it was happening again. But I kept talking, not because I wanted to relive it, but because I was tired of people like Glenn depending on silence. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Ava Rivera, maybe late 30s, sharp-eyed, calm, with the kind of voice that made you feel like she had already read every page twice before walking into the room. She met with me before the first hearing and said, "I want you to understand something. His lawyer may try to make this sound like a simple argument that got out of hand. Do not let that confuse you. The video shows a pattern. He chose to escalate. He chose to hit you. He chose to damage your property. Those were choices." I asked her if the court would care about the racist things he said. She paused for a second before answering. "The law does not always handle hate as cleanly as people wish it did," she said. "But motive matters. Context matters. And the jury will see the full picture." That was honest, and I appreciated it. I did not need someone to promise me a perfect ending. I needed someone to tell me the truth. Glenn hired a lawyer. Of course he did. His name was Richard Bellamy, a polished man with silver hair and a voice so smooth it made you want to check whether your wallet was still in your pocket. At the preliminary hearing, he tried to paint Glenn as a stressed business owner who had lost his temper after a difficult week. He talked about Glenn's family, his work, his taxes, his years in the community. He said Glenn was embarrassed and deeply sorry. The first time I heard that, I almost believed it might be true. Then Glenn looked across the courtroom at me. He did not look sorry. He looked angry, not ashamed, not regretful. Angry that I had made him face consequences. Ava noticed it too. She leaned over and whispered, "Let him keep showing everyone who he is." The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected, Not some huge dramatic hall with marble pillars and sunlight pouring through tall windows. Just beige walls, wooden benches, a flag in the corner, and people waiting quietly for their names to be called. But when the footage played, the room felt completely still. You could hear the air conditioner humming. You could hear somebody shift in their chair. You could hear the click of the keyboard as the clerk marked the evidence. And then there was Glenn on the screen pointing at me, leaning over my car, slapping me, keying the side panel, sitting back in his SUV and smiling. His lawyer tried to say the footage did not capture the full context. Ava stood up and said, "The full context is that the defendant had multiple chances to walk away. He chose not to. The full context is that Ms. Monroe repeatedly tried to de-escalate. He chose to intimidate her. The full context is that after physically assaulting her, he deliberately damaged her vehicle and waited to watch her find it. That is not confusion. That is cruelty." I looked at Glenn then. For the first time, he did not have that smug look on his face. He looked smaller. Not because I had beaten him. Not because I had humiliated him. He looked smaller because the version of himself he had been trying to sell everyone was gone. The camera had taken it away. The case eventually went to trial because Glenn refused to accept a plea deal that included restitution, anger management, community service, and a no-contact order. He wanted to fight. He wanted a jury to save him from the consequences of his own behavior. I think part of him still believed there would be someone in the room who understood why he had done it. Someone who would say, "Sure, he went too far, but she probably provoked him." That is the story he had built his whole life around. That people like him were allowed to be angry, while people like me had to be perfect just to be believed. The trial lasted 3 days. June testified. She wore a flowered blouse and looked terrified walking to the witness stand. But when Richard Bellamy tried to suggest she might not have seen the slap clearly, she leaned into the microphone and said, "Son, I am 71 years old, not blind." The courtroom laughed. Even the judge had to hide a smile, and June looked surprised by her own boldness. Eli testified too. He was nervous, but he handed over the phone video he had taken. It had caught Glenn shouting, "You people do not belong here," just before the slap. Richard tried to question whether the phrase had been misunderstood. Eli looked at him and said, "No, sir, everybody understood it." Then it was my turn. I had practiced my testimony for days. I had written notes. I had imagined every question they could ask me. But when I sat in that witness chair and looked at Glenn across the room, all the practice disappeared. I saw the parking lot again. I saw the white SUV. I felt the heat on my cheek. Ava asked me what I remembered most about that night. I thought about saying the slap. I thought about saying the scratch. But the truth was, what I remembered most was Glenn's face afterward, the way he looked like he expected me to accept it. So I told the jury that, I said, the worst part was not that he hit me. The worst part was not that he hit me. The worst part was that he seemed sure he could. I said it quietly. I did not cry. I did not need to. The room was silent. During cross-examination, Richard Bellamy asked me whether I had said anything that could have made Glenn feel threatened. I looked at him and said, "I told him to find another parking spot." He asked if I had used Glenn's name in a confrontational way. I said, "I read it off his shirt." He asked if I had been angry. I said, "Yes, I was angry." Being angry does not give someone the right to hit you. He asked if I had wanted revenge. I looked at Glenn, then back at Richard. "No," I said. "I wanted him to stop believing he could do this to people." The jury went out to deliberate late in the afternoon. My sister held my hand so tightly that my fingers went numb. Ava sat beside us, reviewing notes she no longer needed, mostly because I think she needed something to do with her hands. Glenn sat at the other table with his lawyer, whispering. Every now and then he looked over at me. I did not look away, not because I was trying to be brave, but because I had spent enough time looking down. When the jury finally came back, the room went quiet in that strange way it does when everybody is afraid to breathe. The foreperson stood up. Glenn was found guilty of assault and criminal mischief. The judge ordered him to pay for the repairs to my car, complete anger management counseling, perform community service, and stay away from me. There were other consequences, too. The footage had spread around Millhaven because several witnesses had posted clips online, and Glenn's roofing business started receiving questions he could not answer. Some people said he deserved to lose everything. Some said one terrible night should not define a man's whole life. I did not know what to think about that. I still do not, honestly. I did not want Glenn ruined. I did not wake up hoping his family would suffer. I wanted accountability. I wanted him to understand that his anger was not some private storm he could throw on to anyone standing nearby. But there is a difference between consequences and revenge, and people argue about that difference all the time. A few months later, I parked at the same Market Basket again. I had avoided it for a while, driving an extra 10 minutes to another store because I could not stand the thought of that parking lot. But one Saturday, I ran out of milk and I decided I was tired of giving that place more power than it deserved. The scratch on my car had been repaired by then. You could not see where it had been unless you knew exactly where to look. I pulled into a space near the entrance, turned off the engine, and sat there for a second with my hands on the steering wheel. The lot was busy. People were rushing around. Carts were rattling. Somebody was arguing with a kid about candy near the door. The world had kept moving like it always does, and I realized that I had changed too. Not into somebody harder, not into somebody angry all the time, just somebody who understood that peace is not the same thing as silence. Sometimes peace means speaking up before someone convinces you that your pain is inconvenient. I walked inside, bought my milk, and on the way out I saw June near the garden center. She was loading birdseed into her trunk. When she noticed me, she smiled and said, "Well, look at you, still parking wherever you please." I laughed and said, "It is a dangerous lifestyle." She shook her head and said, "Do not let anybody make you feel like you do not belong in your own life." I have thought about that sentence ever since, because that is what Glenn tried to do. He tried to make me feel like I had to apologize for taking up space, for existing in a place he had decided belonged to people like him. But he was wrong. He was wrong about me, and he was wrong about what happens when someone finally refuses to be quiet. So now, I want to ask you this. Do you think Glenn got what he deserved, or do you think the consequences went too far for a parking lot argument that spiraled out of control? And if you had been standing there that night, would you have stepped in, pulled out your phone, called for help, or kept walking because it was not your problem? Tell me what you think in the comments, because sometimes the difference between somebody getting away with cruelty and finally being held accountable is not the law, not a camera, not even a courtroom. Sometimes it is just one person deciding not to look away. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about everyday people standing up when they are pushed too far, and remember this, nobody has the right to make you feel small just because they cannot handle being told no.